Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The Day Hypnotism Died by Kevin David Anderson. I didn't believe in them. Most people don't. We chalk it up to mentalist bunk, sleight of hand for the unconscious, only effective on the weak or feeble-minded. But disbelief can dissolve in the span of a moment when evidence to the contrary rips your friends away in a cacophony of blood and screaming. This is about just such a moment. One in which I met the greatest living hypnotist in the world. It was also the moment that I lost 3 good friends. For reasons that I still don't understand. I'm not sure anyone does. "So, Runt, what's this great idea you have?" I had said, as the evening began, the 4 of us strolling toward the boardwalk. We were 4 nerdy, dateless high school seniors looking for action, or as close as we could get to it. "Stop calling me that," James, the smallest of us, said, pushing up his glasses. Russell slapped a beefy hand on my back, and I felt his enormous girth and the friendly thump. "Yeah, Craig, stop calling Runt that." He chuckled, always laughing at his own comments, thinking himself to be the next whatever. James stopped and turned around, glaring. "Look, I hate it when Coach Hansen calls me that, and I sure as hell don't like it when my friends do it." James had been called Runt since before I met him, so it was always a little surprising when he got pissed about it. "Sorry," I said, gesturing to myself, shrugging. "I'm an ass," James continued, glaring, his face turning pink. "Sorry," I repeated. "No, seriously." Sighing, I took a step toward him, holding my arms wide. "Hug?" A smile moved over James's face. "Why don't you just go blow an orc?" I heard Russell and Alan laugh as I dropped my arms. Alan, taller than all of us, stepped forward. "Okay, now that you ladies have bared your feelings," he looked at James. "What's this great idea?" James reached into his back pocket, producing a flyer. It looked old, like some pirate's treasure map. Charred edges and faded black ink. It was all for show, but it was still intriguing. He held it out so we can all read it. "One night only. The greatest hypnotist in the world. South end of the fun zone." "The fun zone?" I said. James met my eyes. "I forgot you're a noob." "It's this carnival that comes to the boardwalk every spring break," Russell said. I nodded. "Was any good?" "No," James said. "Mostly kiddie crap, but this hypnotist thing sounds like just the place for hip guys like us to make an appearance." I smiled. "If we were hip, we'd probably have dates." "Dates?" Alan said. "We're keeping our options open." "Yeah, options open, right?" I nodded. "Alrighty, Runt. Oh, I mean James. Please lead on." We strolled through the fun zone, stopping only to lose some coin at the carnival games, none of us coming close to winning anything. At the south end, we saw a modest circus tent set far enough apart to make me think it wasn't associated with the carnival. "Sheesh, look at that line," Alan said. "Hey, does that say admission $15? Russell pointed a thick finger ahead. "That is steep," I said. James faced us. "Come on, you tightwads. What else do you have to spend it on? Girlfriends?" "All I'm saying is it better be a good show," Russell said as we stepped in line. By the time we made it inside, there were no seats left. People stood along the tent walls, looking impatient. At the side of the stage, I saw a slender, red-headed woman wearing a shimmering spandex outfit and carrying more folded chairs than she could possibly handle. I didn't hesitate. "You all, follow me." My friends fell in line, and we were in good position when she began unfolding the chairs on the left side of the stage. Russell helped her place the last few, and we took our seats. She smiled at him, saying, "Danke." Russell leaned over. What the hell did she just say? My high school German had finally come in handy. She said thank you. "You think German women like big guys?" Russell patted his belly. I was about to say, "Not a chance in hell," when the light suddenly dimmed. A yellowish spotlight flickered to life, dousing the stage in a sickly hue. Stepping into the light, from where I couldn't actually tell, was a tall man dressed in a white tuxedo. His face was largely unremarkable. The kind you would forget only moments after looking away. Even today, I can't recall a single identifying feature. The only thing that lingers with me is that he seemed wrong for the moment. I got the sense that he shouldn't really be there. Not with us, anyway. Like a Anne Rice character, he seemed like someone merely passing through this century. Without a word or facial expression, the man began to conduct a symphony of magic tricks. Mostly boring, stupid stuff. Rabbits out of hats, interlocking rings, and a particularly lousy sleight of hand card trick. Even the music was cheesy. It sounded like there was an organ grinder backstage, turning the crank without any real sense of rhythm. I half expected a monkey in a fez and matching vest to start working the crowd for pocket change. After each trick, there was some polite applause, but most just groaned. "Yo, dude, if this shit keeps up, I'm gonna murder Runt," Russell whispered in my ear. "Right after we get our money back," I said. Suddenly, the hypnotist bowed, still not having said a word, and the stage went dark. There was a smattering of uneasy applause, the kind you might expect after a really awful karaoke performance. In the dim light, we all glared at James. Our diminutive friend seemed to shrivel even smaller under our collective, disapproving glare. The spotlight returned with a suddenness that made me gasp. This time, it was deep crimson, and the redhead from before stepped inside. She brought her hands up to her midsection, interlocking them like a ballerina, and began to speak. Her words seemed purposely slow, seemingly aware that her accent was cumbersome to understand. "You may have heard that hypnotism is the power of suggestion, allowing subjects to believe that others cannot perceive. Many then claim to this kind of power, sideshow frauds, preying on willing minds and degrading the art, offending the true masters." She paused long enough for a few murmurs to bubble up from the audience and then continued. "What you will see tonight is real hypnotism, not the usual carnival freak show that you have all come to expect. On this stage, the wall separating perception from reality will become transparent, and you will see as the hypnotist sees. Fantasy and belief will become one, and as a final act, before becoming part of the hallowed ages, mein Meister will remove the wall between what once thought and what can only be imagined. This evening is the final performance of the last living true Meister, and it should be remembered as the night that hypnotism died." "What the hell?" Russell whispered. "Yeah, that was a little on the dramatic side," I said. The lights came up over the audience and the woman looked out onto the crowd, her expression suddenly pleasant, as if she was a hostess at a dinner party and she had just noticed the other guests. Now, for those of you that wish to become a part of the performance that will be talked about for many centuries to come, please join me, she said, gesturing to the stage. A thin brunette woman stood up in the front row, and the redhead waved her up. Several others stood, moving toward the stage. Then, to my amazement, James stood up. He must have thought that whatever was going to happen to him on stage was less severe than what we were thinking about doing to him for dragging us in here. And then Russell stood up, his wide hips bumping my shoulder. "Dude, what are you doing?" I said. Russell shrugged. "Just thought I'd get a closer look at the hypnotist's assistant." Our two friends walked up on stage as Alan and I stared at each other across two empty chairs. He tilted his head. "You chicken or something?" I narrowed my eyes. "I will if you will." I rocked forward, looking as if I was about to stand up. Alan jumped to his feet. "Sucker." I sat back in my chair, arms folded. He glared at me, shoulders slumped. "You suck." The redhead waved at Alan to join the others on stage. He shot me one last disapproving leer as he walked toward the spotlight. I glanced up at my three friends, feeling very pleased with myself indeed. They stood side by side with 5 other volunteers, all looking anxious and excited. Russell motioned at me to join them on stage. I just shook my head, grinning. Alan cupped his hands around his lips and mouthed the words, "Wussy." At least I think that was what he said. I silently mouthed in return, "Bite me." The hypnotist appeared on stage, and again I didn't notice from where. For whatever reason, his assistant did most of the talking. She asked the volunteers to focus on the hypnotist's index finger, which he raised and held out at arm's length. Without a word, he lowered and raised it over and over again. He did this for at least a full minute, and I could feel the crowd growing restless. The thin brunette even started to giggle, but the redhead assistant gave her a harsh glare and she immediately stopped. After another grueling minute of this, the hypnotist lowered his hand, and as his hand descended, so did the eyelids of the volunteers. All of them. By the time the man's hand was at his side, my friends' heads were all slumped onto one shoulder. My jaw dropped. There were chortles from the crowd. Not the type spawned from a humorous situation, but the kind emitted from a large group of people that are collectively a bit unsure how to react. The redhead looked out over the crowd, holding a finger to her smiling lips. "They sleep now." Her voice was an intense whisper. No shit. I shifted in my seat. Excitement, concern, fear, anticipation, all coursing through my body at once. I was already imagining telling the story to everyone I knew, even though the people I knew and would most likely tell were all up on stage. The hypnotist turned to face the crowd, making a brief gesture, like a man tipping his hat to an elegant lady he chances on the street. Then, with the commanding presence of a conductor, he turned his face to his subjects, instruments ready to be played. He snapped his fingers and the volunteers all awoke, their eyelids fluttering like window shades. Laughter rose from the crowd as the volunteers yawned. Some even stretched as if waking up from a long sleep. Alan looked at me, yawning. He shrugged his shoulders as if to say, "What just happened?" I just returned with a grin, nodding. The crowd quieted and my attention again fell upon the hypnotist. With poised strides, he moved over to the right of the stage, standing in front of a volunteer furthest in line from my friends. The volunteer, a man in his mid-40s, smiled as the hypnotist gazed into his eyes. I could tell the man was very uncomfortable with this. He seemed to arc backward, like a weed bending in a strong wind. The hypnotist moved in, their noses coming close to touching. He stayed there for a moment, a voyeur peeking into a window. The volunteer gazed back, his eyes never blinking. The crowd fell silent, and when the hypnotist finally pulled back to speak a single word, it resonated to all four corners of the tent. Without any hint of an accent, he said, "Spider." The volunteer's eyes slammed shut and he dropped to the floor with a thud. His round belly lay flat on the stage as his arms and legs began to splay outward, grasping for something. Then his hands and feet gripped the stage and he pulled himself up, rising slowly, like a predator searching through the grass for its next meal. His head sunk into his shoulders, and his neck just seemed to have retracted inside of his body. It was horribly uncomfortable to look at, and the crowd gasped, myself included. I could hear people behind me murmur to one another, "Geez, that's incredible. How did he... Knees don't bend that way. Oh, it's just a show. The volunteers are all plants." The redhead raised her hands, attempting to quiet the crowd. The rumblings stifled a bit, but continued. Then, the man on all fours started to rotate and the crowd fell still. Soon, his rear end pointed at the audience, and after a brief hesitation, he started to crawl. A genuine shiver scaled my spine as I watched him scurry across the stage. It wasn't with the motion of a being using 4 legs, but with the dexterity of a creature using 8. The 4 limbs I could see moved in tandem with 4 unseen limbs, and although they remained invisible, I had no doubt that they were there. The back of the stage, shrouded in shadow, appeared to be the man's destination, and my throat went dry as he crawled to the safety of the dark. He spun around, sinking into the blackness, just his head visibly bobbing up and down about a foot off the stage. His pupils, now black, glinted in the stage lights. I could feel the man's humanity slipping away as he looked back at the crowd, no longer recognizing us. The audience was no longer seeing a man. Stunned applause rose from the crowd, but the hypnotist did not stop to acknowledge this. He stepped over, standing in front of the next volunteer, a thin brunette woman. After a similar preamble, the hypnotist said, "Chicken." The woman's eyes fell shut and she hunched slightly. When they opened, her head started darting forward, her arms curled up on her sides, flapping. The hypnotist removed a handful of chicken feet from his pocket, holding it out in front of her. The woman's head darted forward, pecking at the pile in his hand. The crowd again broke out into reserved applause. The hypnotist let the feed fall to the floor, and he slapped his hands together. The woman fell to her knees, pecking at the food on the stage, as the hypnotist took a moment to glance back at the crowd. Although there was no expression on his face, I got the distinct impression that he despised us. Maybe it was in his eyes, but in that brief moment, I felt absolute loathing coming off of him. He turned to the next volunteer as his assistant brought out a large wicker basket. The assistant gestured for the volunteer to step into it, which he did, smiling strangely, as if it were something he did every day. The hypnotist peered into the man's eyes and said, "King Cobra." The volunteer dropped into the basket, disappearing from view. A moment later, he began to rise, but not as a man would stand up. It was more like a snake, ascending to the tune of a snake charmer. The hypnotist took a noticeable quick step backwards, as if he wanted to stay out of striking range. There was some applause, lacking enthusiasm and growing more uneasy. My own hands lay still in my lap, unable to move. The hypnotist gave a nod to his assistant. She stepped behind the basket, its lid in her hand and raised it over the volunteer's head. In a quick motion, she pushed the lid down, forcing the volunteer back into the basket. She wedged it in tight, then glanced at the hypnotist, who had already moved on. The next volunteer became a weasel, who immediately arched his body into an unsavory position and began grooming a very long tail, seen only by himself. The hypnotist next did this thing with a petite woman who, believing herself a gazelle, leapt off the stage, bounded down the main aisle and out the entrance. A man in the crowd, a husband or boyfriend, jumped to his feet and ran out, calling after her. I looked up at my friends, who all waited patiently, as if standing in line at a public restroom. I waved at them, getting their attention. They looked down at me, perplexed, seemingly unaware of the other volunteer's metamorphosis. I motioned them to get off the stage, and before I knew it, I was on my feet, heart pounding, my gestures growing frantic and fearful. Popcorn hit me in the back, and I heard someone say, "Sit down!" Another volley of popcorn and something sticky hit my head. So, I slowly lowered back into my seat. The hypnotist stood in front of Alan, looking him up and down. He gazed into my friend's eyes and said, "Monkey." Alan, suddenly, dropped into a squatted position, his legs tucking under his body, shrinking. He rocked forward on his knuckles, and his tongue shot out over his lips. The hypnotist patted him on the head, then pointed to a thick wooded post that held up the tent's roof. Alan, furrowing a simian brow, then jumped off the stage, his butt inches above the ground. When he reached the post, he leapt up and his sandals fell off his feet. I held my breath as I watched him climb the pole like someone positively born to it. When he neared the ceiling, he stopped, looking down. The hypnotist produced a banana from his pocket and threw it up. Alan, and I swear to God, caught it with his foot. His goddamn foot! I could hear the audience applauding, but it was like distant background noise. The soundtrack to a movie I wish I wasn't watching. The hypnotist turned to Russell. My friend's huge frame towered over the hypnotist, but it cast no illusion about who was in control. The hypnotist leaned forward and said, "Mouse." Russell dropped to the floor. I could feel the thud reverberate under my chair. His near 300-pound body seemed to shrivel, limbs retracting, fingers curling into paws. He looked at me with no recognition, nose twitching with unseen whiskers. Russell's beady eyes scanned the crowd, and it looked as if he were about to run. But just then, the assistant placed a large, clear plastic bowl, face down, on top of Russell's head, and Russell froze. Laughter began to dribble up from the audience as we started to realize Russell believed himself trapped inside the bowl. Russell sniffed at the wall of his prison as the crowd clapped. The hypnotist stepped in front of James, gazing deep. James cocked his head a little, as if he might be in pain, but then straightened. "I think I know what a runt like you wants to be," the hypnotist said. It was the only sentence I heard him say. He took several steps back, giving James a large berth, and he said, "Elephant." James's head slumped forward, as if the weight of a trunk pulled it down, and he landed on all fours. The stage shook, and I could hear wood cracking. He thrashed his head from side to side, and I felt a breeze, almost as if a large set of ears were moving the air like enormous fans. James raised his head upward and bellowed so loud I had to cover my ears. The crowd went silent. Near James's feet, the woman, believing herself a chicken, pecked at the seeds on the stage. James stepped back, looking irritated, and brought his head up high again. I thought he was going to make that awful, inhuman sound, but in the soft tent light filtering through the dust that wafted up from the stage, I saw an outline extending from James's face. Like an apparition, it hung there, thick, long, ghostly. Although I immediately recognized what it was, I still didn't believe it. It was a trunk. An elephant's trunk. James swung it downward in a horrific arc, putting his whole head and upper body into the motion. It caught the woman pecking at the stage across the midsection, lifting her up and hurling her into the air. She crashed into the back curtain, causing the man, now a spider, to scurry out of the darkness. I could hear screams behind me as I looked at the broken woman lying at the back of the stage. She wasn't moving. My eye caught the hypnotist as he stepped over to Russell, who was still trapped inside a bowl. People were knocking into me, toppling chairs, and I struggled to stay where I was. The hypnotist placed a hand on the top of the bowl on Russell's head and drummed his fingers. He looked out at the pandemonium and I saw it again. That look of absolute contempt in his eyes. With a quick movement, he lifted the bowl and Russell wasted no time. He darted forward, nose twitching, beady eyes scanning back and forth. Then, he seemed to catch sight of the man who believed himself a weasel and he froze. The weasel met the rodent's gaze and began to pounce. Russell retreated back towards James, the weasel in fast pursuit. The two began running around James in wide circles. James was getting upset and started rising up on his hind legs and stomping his front feet down, shaking the stage. I rushed forward, reaching out with the intention of grabbing Russell, but the mouse had scurried under one of James's front feet, just as it came down. The next thing I heard was a grotesque popping, like a watermelon in a trash compactor. The crushing sound was still echoing in my ear when James raised his foot, which had just reduced the midsection of Russell's enormous girth to the width of a pizza box. James continued to stomp, transforming Russell's head into a pulpy mass of gelatin. The stage began to sway, and I could hear metal tearing and wood splintering. Someone careened into my chest, spinning me around toward the tent's entrance, the only exit now clogged with bodies. Over the screaming, I could hear the canvas tearing as new exits were being created along the tent walls. Even though there seemed no point, James still brought his foot down on Russell's remains over and over again. Unable to endure the pounding, the stage collapsed with a crash so loud it momentarily drowned out the sounds of panic. The large wicker basket toppled into the seats, its lid rolling down the aisle. The man inside began to slither out. The collapsing of the stage had somehow calmed James, and I started moving towards him. I didn't know if I could snap him out of this, but I sure as hell was going to try. I approached him from the side, just outside of his peripheral vision. I was about to stretch out my hands, preparing to clasp his shoulders when I hit something. My face collided with a leathery but soft surface. I put my hands up, feeling the thick, wrinkled skin. I blinked my eyes, but I could not see what my hands could feel. As my fingers slid over thick folds of warm flesh, I felt tiny, sporadic hairs bending beneath my palms. And as I brushed over them, their pale outlines began to flicker into view. I stared at my hands, caressing in the air, watching them rise up and down slowly. Looking through my fingers at James, I realized that my hands rose up and down as James breathed. My friend looked back at me, his head craning around as if it swiveled on a large neck. Indifference glinted in his eyes. He turned forward and started lumbering toward the center aisle. Something caught me hard on the side and I toppled back. Reflecting back, I can only imagine what struck me was James's unseen rear leg or hip as his elephant exterior moved by. I landed on the front row of chairs, my head cracking against a seat. Blood trickled into my eye as I pushed myself up. My first thought was to look for James, but something else above caught my attention. High up on the tent ceiling, a man defied gravity, moving like an arachnid, clinging to the canvas. His sunken black eyes gazed down, and I swear to God, it looked as if he were trying to spin a web. A banana peel landed on my head, and I heard Alan, still high above the seats, laugh like a chimpanzee. I slapped the peel from my scalp and looked down the aisle. Wooded chairs had been reduced to splinters under James's weight. I just caught sight of him as he moved out the exit, his unseen bulk catching in the opening's aluminum frame. The metal twisted, and the entire tent shifted in the direction James was moving. I thought it would come down around me, but then he broke free and the whole canvas room snapped back with a violent jolt. I hustled down the aisle, jumping over wreckage. When I reached the exit, I turned around looking back at the collapsed stage. I think I wanted to get one last look at the hypnotist. The man, or being, responsible for all this chaos. Try to remember his face, mark it in my mind, so I could identify him later. But he and his assistant were gone. The only thing I saw was a man, now free from his basket, coiling himself around the broken, still body of the woman James had hurled through the air. Running out of the tent, I tried to force the image from my mind of the man attempting to swallow the dead woman whole. James's trail wasn't hard to pick up. I just followed the crushed cars and injured people and screams. By the time I caught up to him, a county deputy was trying to block his path. The officer stood in the middle of the street, directly in front of James. People who had seen the destruction were yelling at him to move, but the young deputy stood his ground. "Get out of the way!" I screamed, running just behind James. I waved my arms to the side. "Please, just move!" The officer must have thought he was dealing with a drunk, but at the last second, he must have seen something because he went for his gun. The muzzle had just cleared the holster when James hit him. The deputy slammed to the ground, and I cringed at that familiar popping sound. He managed to scream, but it was instantly muffled as a large foot crushed the deputy's head. I tried not to look as I stepped by, but my peripheral caught one of the man's legs, still twitching, glistening crimson in the downward glow of a street lamp. I followed my friend for several blocks, watching him careen into parked cars like a cornered animal. He seemed disoriented, frightened, but he never stopped moving. I tried talking to him, but there just wasn't enough human there to hear me. We both turned a corner and I saw a barricade of black and whites blocking our path. I could tell by the amount of weapons drawn that the cops were not interested in apprehending James. That boat had sailed when they lost one of their own. When he noticed the police line, James slowed for a few steps and then charged. I felt bullets cut through the air over my head before I heard them. I dropped to the ground, covering my face. When I finally looked up, James was on his knees, shots still tearing into him. I thought they would stop shooting after James lay still on the pavement, but it kept on for a while until a burly voice finally yelled, "Cease fire!" I envisioned myself running over to James, holding him in my arms to hear his final words like they do in the movies, but when I started to get up, the same burly voice yelled, "Don't move, asshole! Put your hands out where we can see them!" 20 minutes later, I was still wearing the handcuffs the owner of that burly voice, a Sheriff Kincaid, I believe, had slapped on my wrists. He questioned me in the back of the squad car, his large Stetson rubbing on the inside of the roof. "How well did you know the deceased?" Kincaid asked. He was my friend," I said. We called him Runt. That was just over a year ago. I did spend some time trying to track down that hypnotist. So did Sheriff Kincaid and a few private detectives hired by relatives of the 9 confirmed victims from that night. At least 3 others are still missing. From their pictures in the paper, I recognize them as other volunteers. And after all this time, I'm pretty sure their families, at least if they knew what I knew, would prefer that they stay missing. One of the volunteers that isn't missing is my friend Alan. And I'm ashamed to admit it, but I can't bring myself to visit him anymore. He's been a resident of the Riverdale County Mental Institute since that night. I stopped driving up to see him shortly after hair started to sprout all over his body. Sheriff Kincaid said he looks like something that stepped out of Planet of the Apes. Alan shares a floor at the sanitarium with a teenager who hunts rodents with the cunning of a weasel, and a woman that leaps like a gazelle. I don't think the hypnotist's final performance will ever fade into the past for me. My nightmares keep it in the forefront of my mind, and every animal I see in the wake of day always has some human feature that makes me wonder. Today, I received a news clipping in the mail from Sheriff Kincaid. It described how he and his men were called when someone found a monster-sized cobra. It had been nesting under the boardwalk, feeding on cats, dogs, and some missing children, I think. How a cobra had managed to make it to the United States was still a mystery. But what concerned most were the strange appendages that ran along its underbelly. They were reported to resemble human fingers.
Chilling tales for dark nights.